All right.
Yeah, it's probably 7. It's probably late to get to work.
Okay. And I'm going to sit today. Hope that doesn't bother you guys, but I just ran 10 miles, so I don't feel like standing. All right. So we are in 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 12 to 19. We got to pretty much got to verse 13 last week, but so we'll see if we can get a little further today. Huh?
Ken's out here slow.
Yeah. As long as Ken's not here, we can move much quicker pace. All right. So 1 Peter chapter 4, starting in verse 12. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testing, as though some strange thing were happening to you. But to the degree that you share in the sufferings of Christ, keep on rejoicing, so that also at the revelation of his glory, you may rejoice in his exaltation. If you, being reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of God, Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. Make sure that none of you suffers as a murderer, or a thief, or an evildoer, or a troublesome meddler. But if anyone suffers as a Christian, he is not to be ashamed, but is to glorify God in this name. For it is time for judgment to begin with the household of God. And if it begins with us first, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel? And if it is with difficulty that the righteous is saved, what will become of the godless man and the sinner? Therefore, those who suffer according to the will of God shall entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is right. So, we started to look at this, we looked at this last week. We looked at verse 12 and the beginning of 13. We said that, we shouldn't, verse 12 basically makes it clear we shouldn't be surprised when suffering comes. We should expect it. He talks about it being a fiery ordeal, which we said was literally happening, right? Nero was literally lighting people up on fire. So that wasn't, I don't think, just some imagery, but pointing out the extreme of what was happening as far as the suffering of believers. And so he says that those ordeals would be a testing for us, testing of our faith. And so we shouldn't think it's something strange that's happening to us, which many that profess Christ today are finding it strange that this is happening. Like, this isn't the way it's supposed to be, especially the postmates. No. But it says that, to the degree that we suffer, who do we suffer with? With Christ. And that's the thing to remember. He's doing two things in that. One, he's providing the model for us. I mean, who suffered more than Christ? Nobody. No one's ever going to suffer more than Christ suffered. Christ suffered for sin he didn't commit, but it wasn't that he just suffered for someone else's sin. He suffered for the sin of many others, billions of others. And so you look at that and realize, okay, he took all of that upon himself, and he suffered an eternal consequence. So looking at that, we end up seeing that none of us could ever suffer the way Christ did. So he's the ultimate example. But it's also a reassurance for us too. If Christ suffered through all of this, we can suffer a far less suffering than what he did. And that's why it commands us keep on rejoicing. That word rejoicing is a command. It's an imperative in the Greek. So we should keep on rejoicing. Sounds so strange, doesn't it? Rejoice when you're suffering. But, if you read like Voice of the Martyrs, or you read, forgetting, there's several books. I'm trying to remember the books on those who died as martyrs. Fox's Book of Martyrs, thank you. And I know that Voice of the Martyrs has a new Jesus Freaks. They have a couple volumes called Jesus Freaks. But you read some of those, and what do you see? You see people, they're being killed for the name of Christ, and they're rejoicing. They're praising God. You can look at Stephen in Acts. What's happening? They're stoning him to death, and he's looking up to heaven, rejoicing and asking God to forgive those who are stoning him. What happens at that? Well, that makes an impact on some people, at least for Paul. He was there, right? And so that's a common thing that we end up seeing is people who rejoice in God through suffering end up bringing glory to God and to a world that it stands out. I mean, it stands out as such opposite behavior. So, but we left off there. But so he says, keep on rejoicing so that at the revelation. Okay, so now we get into some fun discussion. What is the revelation? Anyone want to take some guesses? Is it the book of Revelation? Is it the return of Christ? Right. So the term in Greek, it means an uncovering. Okay. Or some revealing something. That's why it's revelation. But he tells us what it is. It says, at the revealing of his glory. Now, when is his glory going to be revealed? Well, this could be a reference to his second coming. Some would take that, and that is true. I think that at his second coming, those who rejoice under persecution will be that will be revealed at that time. But for who Peter's speaking to, are they going to be alive during the second coming? No, obviously not. Right? So I don't think that this is going to be just this idea of a manifestation of his glory, that it's only the second coming. I think that his glory ends up being manifested, at the time that we're actually rejoicing in suffering. Okay.
So some would say just the second coming, and then some would expand it to mean when you see
I think it's expanded. Yeah, I think it's more, because he's not using this in a future tense, right? He's saying to keep on. The word keep there is present tense, right? And so if we're going to keep on presently for something that's never going to happen in our lifetime, those two they're not connected then, right? Now, if it was a future tense, if he was saying to keep on in the future, I could see that pointing to those who are going to live at the time of the second coming.
But isn't this type of language throughout the New Testament of waiting for his return, but not speaking to them directly?
Yeah, there are. You're right. There are times where Christ will speak in the present, in a present idea, as like to wait for the coming. But this is an action he wants us to do now that is the resulting in this manifestation of his glory, right? So I think that because the so that makes a connection there, right? You keep on rejoicing so that at the manifestation or the revelation of his glory, you may rejoice with exaltation. So this rejoicing is, again, it's something that is going to be done, currently. This is it's the rejoice is actually an aorist, which means it's a present activity that has a future result. And so when we look at this, what I think it would be saying is that, God's glory is going to be revealed actually through our suffering. And I think we see that at times when we look at, these different people who suffer for the sake of Christ and rejoice in that time. The byproduct of that often is God being glorified. And so it's the revelation of his glory that ends up being revealed. So I don't think it's, could it be at the second coming? Yeah, absolutely. At the second coming, there's going to be many who are going to rejoice in suffering, and that'll bring the manifestation of God's glory will be there. But I think it's also in our day and age and in Peter's day and age. I think he's saying that whenever anybody is going to be doing this, going to rejoice in suffering, it's going to manifest God's glory. And this is why I say when you see people, and I'll say this knowing she's not here but still watching online, but Yim and I were talking how, like, the other night, Gina's been like really sick, and yet she's going out, like trying to go out every night to evangelize, and John and I got together last night, and he's like, yeah, Gina's out on the streets right now. We're like, and we're both just sitting there like, yeah, oh, well, it's too cold. I'm not going to go. Right. It's like she's in pain, yet she's still going out on the street evangelizing. Like, that brings glory to God when you know someone's suffering and still rejoicing and doing what God calls us to do, right? That brings God glory. And so we get to see that even now, right? That gets revealed now. So.
I like Justin Pierce gave an example of this man. He was in a wheelchair. He has cerebral palsy.
Mm-hmm. Justin has cerebral palsy, yes.
A lot worse than Justin has, and he would ride his wheelchair 5 miles back and forth to church every Sunday, like, even in the rain and everything. And like how God didn't heal him, but God is being glorified in his like faithfulness, even in the rain, even in the cold. And he has like bumper stickers, like Jesus bumper stickers on his back, and I just really love that story. It just really brings the truth of that.
Yeah.
In our sufferings, in our hardships, we bring glory to God through this.
Yeah.
Through enduring.
Justin actually has at the end of one of his talks, he goes to a couple of people, not just that person, but he'll also talk about trying to remember what her handle is. Headstick Deb, I think, is her. But she basically has like a pencil, or stick on that she straps to her head, so she blogs like this. Yeah, because she can't type, she can't use her hands, so she literally just hits her head on the keyboard to type. Think about how long that takes. You think one finger is a lot, and so he lists a whole bunch of people who are handicapped and have different ailments, and yet they really glorify God in their service. Justin will often talk about I just forgot his last name. David. I forgot his last name, but he speaks at G3 sometimes. That's where I've heard him. And he's quadriplegic. He's in a wheelchair. And he sits there and preaches. He's got no notes. He's got no Bible because he can't turn the pages. He's just memorized it all. And so it's like, okay. And when we see that, what's our reaction? We're humbled by that. We glorify God when we see that, right? That's the revelation of his glory. And why? So that we may rejoice with exaltation. The idea of it, we rejoice exceedingly. That's the word exaltation. It's exceedingly or overjoyed. So we might rejoice with overjoyment. That we would be ecstatic. And that's what that does. When we see someone who is, we expect that someone who's suffering, who has an ailment, is just going to stay home and be like, oh, I can't do anything. And we see someone that overcomes that. They go and they do, work for God. We realize, wow, look at what they're doing. And it brings a great joy to the believers. It brings befuddlement to the unbelievers, right? They don't understand it. They can't comprehend when you go and do when something's done to you, and they know how they would respond. They'd lash out in the flesh, and you don't. Right? That stands out more. And so that's we should be a rejoicing people, even in suffering. So any questions with verse 13? Kenny, you look like you're comparing some passages there.
I'm looking at 2 Timothy 2. 9 through
12. Yeah. Because that was a cross-reference in your Bible there.
Oh, yeah. For which I suffer trouble as an evildoer, even unto bonds with the word of God is not bound. Therefore I do all things for the elect's sake, that they may also obtain salvation, which is in Christ Jesus, with eternal glory. It is a faithful saying, for if we be dead with him, we shall also live with him. If we suffer, we shall also reign with him. If we deny him, he also will deny us.
Yeah. And so
even if you go back to like verse 7, Peter's talk in verse 7, I think when he says, but the end of all things is at hand.
Yeah, in 1 Peter.
Kind of like Sarah said, but
Well, see, and
there's certain phrases that are used that are talking about the imminent return of Christ. In other words, obviously, he says the end of all things is at hand. Obviously, it didn't happen right away. It's still, it doesn't mean that it's not, that we don't read it as being imminent.
well, if this is a good cross-reference to 2 Timothy, then I think there it would say, when do we see the glory of God is in our death? And that could be too.
Yeah.
And so, if that's the case, right, then yeah, we would end up seeing that in our death, we will be glorified, and his glory will be revealed when we're instantly turned into a glorified state. Yeah.
No, I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying. Even in the next verse in 14,
Mm-hmm.
if you reproach from you, rejoice happy, right? For the spirit of glory and of God resteth upon you. On your part he is spoken of, but on your part he is glorified.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, I memorize everything in KJV, so it comes out funny. Sorry.
But it's an easier translation to memorize. That's why.
Passage, but for I reckon that our present sufferings are not worthy to be compared to the glory that will be revealed in us, which I think goes so perfectly with this.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. But you see, a lot of it, what's Peter constantly throughout this book trying to do is he's preparing us for suffering. He's constantly trying to reshift our focus, right? Off of self and onto Christ. That's the key to dealing with suffering. The key to dealing with suffering is to get the focus off of self and onto Christ. And when we do that, we can endure suffering. When we don't do that, we're going to struggle with suffering. I mean, that's really, if you look through the entire book of 1 Peter, That's really the reoccurring theme. Get your eyes focused on Christ, right? And he's doing it a lot of different ways. Look at your salvation, look at your inheritance, look at what God did for you, look at Christ's example, look at what submission is. I mean, over and over and over again, everything is eyes off of self, eyes on Christ. So, I mean, that's really the key. And the more our eyes are fixed upon Christ, the easier things are going to go when we do suffer. The easier it's going to be for us to do what's right, to rejoice in suffering, because our eyes are fixed on that which is eternal, not that which is temporal. So let's look at verse 14. If you are reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. So the word for reviled, we've seen before, it's this idea of mockery, to reproach, to heap insults upon. Okay, so when someone does that to you, when someone's constantly, they're mocking you for Christ's sake, then we're blessed. Now, this word blessed, makarios, is the same word that you see in Matthew 5, the Beatitudes. Okay, it's the idea of a blessing or a privilege, of being happy. And so what you have here is that when you have your eyes fixed upon Christ, guess what? They insult you, it won't bother you, because they insulted Christ. Isn't that exactly what he said? He said they're going to insult us and kill us because they did it to him. So we should expect that. Christ told us that. So when they do this, and this is the big key here, though, where he's going to get into, if they revile you for the name of Christ, you are blessed. Why that? Because in the very next verse, he's going to talk about other reasons that people suffer mockery and reviling. And it's not for the name of Christ, right? So there is a difference here. This is to point out that not all suffering is in the name of Christ. Some suffering is because people are prideful jerks, right? You see the guys, you sometimes see these guys on the street, if you do a lot of street ministry, and you see the guys that are just talking down to people, and they're just insulting people, call them all kinds of names and saying, that they're not saved. And then those people react and start throwing things at them or calling them names. And then they walk away and go, "Oh, I suffered for Christ's sake." No, you didn't. You suffered what you deserved. You acted like a jerk and they treated you like a jerk, right? That's not suffering for Christ. Suffering for Christ is when you stand up in righteousness and you don't call them names, even when they're calling you names. I can't remember if it might have been Mike Stockwell. We were at I think it was Indianapolis at the Super Bowl evangelizing. And I think someone threw a sandwich at him, like a hoagie. And he caught it and goes, "Thanks for lunch." His attitude was just, "Hey, thanks for lunch." I'm sure they didn't mean it that way, but it was really, really cold. And he ended up saying that was not, it did actually hurt. But, his whole attitude, I mean, everyone that looked, I remember all of us were just like, the attitude was like, "Hey, like, that's okay, thanks." That's the whole thing, is that there's a comparison Peter's going to make here between when they revile you in the name of Christ and they revile you because of your own behavior. Okay, so there is a difference. But he's saying if you're reviled for the name of Christ, then you're blessed. But look at what he says in verse 15. "Make sure that none of you suffers as a murderer, thief, or evildoer, or troublesome meddler." That's the contrast. So the word here for to make sure, it's the idea here of of a of a judgment, of a it's the idea of kind of a suffering of some experience. So the idea here is that you have some experience, someone, some, in this case, a bad experience, an evil experience. And he's saying here, we have to make sure, or not be kind of disgraced by it. And so he says that we have to make sure none of us suffers for, as these things. So the suffering here, we got to make sure we're not going to be suffering some kind of, in some way where we are acting as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or a troublesome meddler. Okay, so the idea here is we have to be, if someone murders someone and they suffer a consequence for that, whose fault is that? It's their fault, right? They what did they get? They got what they deserved. If they suffer because of Christ, whose fault is that? They suffer because they didn't do anything wrong. They just named the name of Christ. Whose fault is that then? The people who are mocking and reviling, right? So what we end up seeing is that he's drawing this contrast. Now, as Peter likes to do, what does he do? He goes to extremes, right? He's going to a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, and a troublesome meddler. It's just a funny term, right? Troublesome meddler. It literally means one who oversees other people's affairs. Busybody, right? And so it is kind of interesting that he goes from this the extreme, like a murderer, to a thief. That's a little bit less than a murderer. To an evildoer. Well, that's a little less than a thief. To just a busybody, right? What is he doing in that? He's basically running the gamut. If someone is reviling you because you murdered someone, well, you deserved it. If someone's reviling you because you were a thief, well, you deserved it. If they're reviling you because you were some evildoer, you deserved it. And the one that we might think shouldn't be as big of a deal, but if they're reviling you because you're a busybody, you're into someone else's business, then it's your fault, right? That's not suffering for the cause of Christ. And so we have to be careful. I mean, a lot of people go, "Oh, I'm suffering for Christ's sake." I knew a guy that, and I don't even know if I probably shared this, but if I did, oh well, I'll share it again. I used to know a guy that I worked with, and he would spend probably, if not 8 hours, at least 6 of 8 hours every day on the job site evangelizing and passing tracts around. Every day he'd walk through the entire building and putting tracts everywhere. Okay. And they fired him. And he came to church and to prayer meeting and asked for prayer because he was being persecuted at work. And, an uncomfortable thing that I had to do was to correct that and say, no, Joe, you weren't fired for persecution. You were fired because you were getting paid to do a job that you weren't doing. You were spending your job evangelizing. He was like, well, they fired me because I was evangelizing. Yeah, on company time. Like, you were getting paid to do something and you were spending your entire day. I said, because he used to want to come in my office and I'd say, come in during lunchtime. I'd only let him in my office during lunch because I didn't want to be guilty of, I didn't want to be associated with it. But, if what I do on my lunch hour is my lunch hour, right? But he'd come in and he'd want us to just sit and talk theology. And I'm like, I got work to do. And so that wasn't being fired for the name of Christ. He wasn't suffering for Christ's sake. He was suffering because he wasn't doing what he got paid, what he was hired to do. They didn't fire him for evangelizing per se. They did, but they fired him because he wasn't doing his job, whether he was evangelizing or doing something else, right? That's the thing there. And so when we look at this, we have to realize, like, there's a difference between suffering for Christ's sake and suffering for your own sake.
blessed, your reward is great, and all those things.
Mhm.
Like reward, it's not like chalking up like crowns. Well, maybe it is, but like more like is the reward basically talking about that's just fruit that you're saved, right? Because if you're being reviled for Christ, it's not because of arrogant. Oh yeah, Jesus is the way. You didn't know, like not being like trying to invoke someone, but you cross paths and you take a stand for Christ in that moment, and they revile you. They might use curse words or whatever in your direction. Like would that be being reviled for Christ? And what the reward be like? Is that just evidence that you're saved, or is there an actual like reward because you took a stand for Christ in the moment?
Well, I think there is some sort. I mean, even this text would say there's a reward when that happens because God's glory is being revealed. If it's for Christ's sake.
As long as not like arrogant motive.
Correct.
Right?
Correct. Yeah. And look, we get it all the time. You go out on the street and you evangelize, especially if you do open air, and you're going to see all the people that are they're going to walk by and mock.
Yeah. I've seen someone in Princeton that he was street preaching, and people would walk by and say all sorts of curse words at the guy.
Yeah.
Wow, it really brings out the
brings out
evil, man.
the worst in people. But
everyone could be so like nice that you would think.
Yeah.
Down, even Princeton, New Jersey, and then as soon as someone's street preaching, the words foul mouth words come out.
Yeah.
That's God.
And if it was anything else, it wouldn't be.
Right.
I've asked people on the street. I've said, hey, I got a question for you. If you don't like jazz, would you say the same thing about if I was out here playing jazz music? And people will be like, no. So why do you do it when I'm preaching the gospel? Is it because you know it's true and you're trying to suppress that truth and unrighteousness? Right? I mean, that's the reality. They're and they usually it's kind of a drive-by or a walk-by insult. They yell something as they keep walking. But the idea here that Peter's making is that it's a blessing if we suffer for Christ's sake. It is not a blessing if we suffer for our sake. Okay, if we deserve that suffering because of our own behavior, we're doing something in the flesh, in for self, for our own pride, then that's not going to be, we're not going to reveal God's glory in that setting, because all we're revealing is our own glory, right? Our own pride. And so when we get the insults, well, that's because we deserved it. All right. He says in verse 16, but if anyone suffers as a Christian, so you see the contrast. He kind of sandwiched it. He started off in verse 14, if you're reviled for the name of Christ, the contrast that you're reviled for because of your own behavior. But if anyone, and actually anyone suffers is not in the Greek. It's actually, but if as a Christian. So the translators added that in for understanding of, if anyone's suffering as a Christian, he is not to be ashamed, but to glorify God in his name. So the whole thing that we're saying here is, if we're going to be in a situation where we are actually suffering as a Christian, now what is the contrast? Well, if we're a troublesome meddler, we're not acting like a Christian. If we're an evildoer, a thief, a murderer, we're not acting as a Christian. So it's one that's going to do it in the name of Christ. They're going to take their suffering because they're proclaiming God, the name of Christ. They're acting as Christ. They're acting as a Christian. They're suffering for that sake. Then we shouldn't be ashamed. We shouldn't feel like, oh, why are we going through this? In fact, we should realize this is to God's glory. We're actually glorifying his name when we suffer as Christians. That's going to be really important, because you're going to see, I think we're going to see, as more suffering comes, I actually think we're going to see a lot of different reactions from people. I think that we're going to have more and more of the government coming in, and we're going to see more Christians suffering. And I think you're seeing the rise of some Christians, not all, and not even, we're seeing a rise of Christians that are becoming very anti-government. Now, do they have a good case in some cases? Well, yeah, I mean, we see the government overreach, and we see them that they're violating the law. But I think that what we're going to end up seeing is, and I have seen this in some circles, where you're starting to see Christians organize to actually as if to react to the government, to make a stand, like to fight the government, create a revolution. And I don't think Christians are alone in that. I think there's a lot of people that are, getting to that point. But for Christians, the question becomes, okay, we're going to start to see when the government cracks down, why are they going to be cracking down? Some people are going to crack down because you're naming the name of Christ. Others, they're going to crack down because they're going to be seeing that these guys are, making threats against the government. Well, which one's acting as the Christian at that point? When they come down, is it real is it real persecution, Christian persecution, when you've made threats against the government and they respond? Well, no, that's in that verse 15 category, right? When you don't make threats against the government, you may speak out against the government legally, as we can do. At least in this country, we have that right. And we speak out against our government, but we're doing it in a respectful way, in a biblical way. And they start persecuting us because we're Christians. Well, then that's going to be a different story. And I think we're going to see a lot of that, unfortunately, very soon. So any questions down to verse 16? Okay. Let's look at, we'll see how far we can make it, but verse 17. For it is time for judgment to begin. And some of you are going, wait, it was time back then? I mean, in that time, it was time for it to begin. Because we would look at this and say, well, gee, it looks like it's happening now, right? If it began back then what do we have now? Or just a continuation, right? So this is the idea of the idea here is that it's time for justice. That's something we hear a lot of nowadays, right? We hear lots of talk about justice. And we end up going, I don't think that word means what you think that means. This is the idea, though. It's a time that a judgment is going to begin. And where's it going to begin? It's going to begin with the household of God. Now, when we often think of judgment, we often think of, getting a sentence in court for someone that's guilty. That's true. Can mean that. But it's also, this is a time of, what does a judge do? He gives a judgment. It's the time of making that declaration. Okay? And he says that the judgment is going to begin with the household of God. Those that profess to be Christians, that's where it's going to begin. And he gives a contrast here. He says, and if it begins with us, right? If the suffering begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who did not obey the gospel, right? If we're going to have a judgment, and our judgment, we would say starts here on earth, that's our suffering, right? What's it going to be for the unbeliever? And I'm sure, Sarah, I'm sure that you've heard this on the streets. People will say, well, this is hell, right? We start talking about heaven and hell, and they're like, well, this is hell. I think this is the earth is hell. My response usually is, no, this is nothing like it. This is as good as life is going to get if you go to hell. And if you think this life is bad, you're going to realize hell's a whole lot worse. And that's the idea here, right? This life is a judgment for us. This life is as bad as it's going to get for us. But if it begins with us, it starts with the household of God. It starts with believers on earth. We have eternity to look forward to. What's going to happen to the unbeliever? What do they have to look forward to in death? Right? Far worse than any suffering that we have. Now, what does that do to our mindset then? If we realize that if we were unbelievers, where would we be when we die? Hell. So the fact that we're not going there, right? The fact that we suffer in this life, and what we can say is, this is as bad as it's going to get. it's only going to get better. But we know that we're saved from hell. We're saved from what's far worse. So the fact that things get worse for us in this life should only cause us to go, it's going to end soon. We got heaven to look forward to. I'm not like an unbeliever who has nothing but hell to look forward to. It's going to be far worse for them. You see how that can affect the way when we go through trials, our thinking, right? It's just, again, another thing Peter's just putting in our mind to say, if you're thinking this way, you can endure this. Does that make sense? All right. But it puts you to sleep, I know.
I'm a yawner. Oxygen deprived. I'm always interested.
Deprived of many things, not just oxygen.
Sunday morning it's real, but Wednesday's luck.
All right. So any questions from verse 17? So here what he does in verse 18 is he's going to quote from Proverbs 11:31, and he says, and if this is difficult, if it is with difficulty that the righteous are saved, what will become, or literally where will appear the godless and the sinner? Okay. And so what he's basically saying here is we're going to have difficulty, right? And so this here is the idea of difficulty or something that's rare. Okay, it's not your everyday thing. It's something scarce. But if it's going to be with difficulty or scarcity, that the righteous are saved. Now, just stop there and realize something. That right there tells us something, right? We shouldn't expect lots of people to be believers. You have people that think like everyone's going to be saved. Well, this says it's going to be scarce. So if it's a scarcity that the righteous will be saved, what's going to become of the godless or the sinner? All right. A godless man it's in the Greek is an ungodly, profane person. Okay. The idea of a sinner is someone who they miss the mark. So he's saying here to emphasize what he just said about, hey, those as Christians, we shouldn't be ashamed because we're going to have eternal life, right? This is the judgment starts in the household of God here on earth. For us, the judgment is coming for the unbeliever. And then he says, it's going to be difficult for the people to get saved, but what's the outcome? What's the result of the godless? Hell, eternal fire. Now think about that in light of how he started in verse 12, right? He's talking about a fiery ordeal, right? A physical fiery ordeal. How long is that fiery, as horrible as it would be to be burned to death, how long is that going to last? Compared to eternity in a fiery ordeal, right? I think there's a little bit of a contrast he's trying to draw to, because what becomes of the godless and the sinner is the eternal lake of fire. That's their result. So he's making his point. Now he comes to his conclusion in verse 19. Therefore, those of you who suffer according to the will of God shall entrust their souls to a faithful Creator who's doing what's right. So the word entrust there is actually an imperative. It's a command. It means to set before, to demonstrate, to point out. And so what he's saying here is, therefore those who suffer this way, the way he's giving this contrast in suffering as a Christian and as a non-Christian, basically, is someone who's suffering for God versus suffering for self. He says, if you're suffering the right way, you're suffering according to the will of God. Now just stop there and realize, yes, suffering is the will of God. God, and we talked about this last week. Suffering has a purpose. It has the purpose of us enduring so that it will complete us and mature us in our faith. And the more that we are like that, the more that we're matured, the more we become more and more like Christ. And so if that's the focus, right, then suffering is actually part of God's will. Now, someone needs to explain that to all the faith healers, right? All the word of faith people that think that there's no suffering. What do they do with a passage like this? For those who also suffer according to the will of God. Yeah, they skip it. This may be a good passage when you come to someone that's word of faith to ask them, to bring it up. God's will is to suffer. We see that in Philippians 1:29. Just it is for just as God has declared for you. Well, I'm doing it from two different translations and trying to do it from memory. So, for to you it has been granted for Christ's sake not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake. God granted suffering. And so the whole idea here is that to those also who suffer according to the will of God shall entrust their souls. Who are they going to entrust their souls to? A faithful creator. Not just that, a faithful creator doing what is right. So what's the focus? It's on who God is. We can entrust our soul. We can put our trust in the hands of this creator who does what's right. Can we trust a creator like that? Can we trust God like that? Yeah. That's the whole point. His whole conclusion is that, we're going to suffer. It's God's will to suffer, but we're going to suffer putting our faith, our trust in God. So again, what's the result? It's not focus on self, it's focus on God. And that's throughout this whole epistle, that's what Peter's trying to get through to us, is to get our eyes on Christ, not on self. What happens in suffering? We will put our eyes on self. This is the whole reason we're going through this book now, before the great suffering I think that's going to come, right? Is to be prepared. Because now's the practice. Now when the suffering is little, is the practice for a greater suffering that may come later. And if we're prepared now, we're going to we'll have our eyes fixed on self, but on Christ when the larger thing comes. But if we fail in the smaller suffering, and we ignore the smaller suffering, when the greater suffering comes, where's our mindset going to be? On self, right? So now is really the time to prepare. Now's the time to really practice rejoicing in our suffering. Okay? Because later is going to be too late. Right? It's going to be too late to say, when the real suffering comes in, then I'll prepare. Then I'll get ready. No, you won't. It'll be too late then. And so what we want to do is prepare now. All right? Any questions at all? Gina says, you mean the Bible's not about me? No, sorry, Gina, it's not. I know she meant it as a joke, but that is how a lot of people read the Bible, isn't it? And that's how a lot of teachers teach people. Read yourself into the Bible. The Bible's not about you. The Bible's about God. And this is I think the big problem with Christianity, why it's so anemic in our culture. Because we've had an American Christianity that talks about everything's about you having a better life, you having a comfortable life, you having everything you want. We only want to talk about things that make you feel happy. And so many churches focus on that. They're not preparing anyone for suffering. In fact, they're preparing people to fail in suffering because they're encouraging everybody to focus on self, which is the very thing that God says not to do.
Your experience with America, like you said, American Christianity is kind of distorted in some ways. So how much are we too comfortable and maybe not doing enough? Like, how do we gauge, like, oh, we're doing it, and we're doing too much, and then it becomes like, you know, like we're overdoing it, like legalistically, and then maybe some of us are like just laying back too much and not getting involved. So, in your experience, how would you gauge that?
How do I gauge
If you can come up with that, if you can't, then I understand. It's like between you and
it's
God.
actually, it's actually for every individual.
Okay.
What is God putting in your life that's going to be different than anyone else in this room's life, right? Every one of us is going to suffer differently. We have different things. Some of us, suffer physical ailments. Some of us have have a mental ailment. Some of us, it could be financial. It could be, suffering by people that are name calling or doing things, reviling us. A lot of different ways that we're gonna deal with suffering. The thing is, it's all, though the suffering, it may end up being different. What we should do about it's the same. We glorify God. We rejoice.
Am I relaxing too much, or am I like overdoing it too much? Like, sometimes always back and forth, like struggle. But I don't know. I guess it's hard to tell, like, exactly.
Yeah, I remember my first church. There was a lot of debate in the leadership. They were trying to set up priorities. And we had two guys. They were constantly arguing that. One guy would say, "Well, whenever you have priorities, it should be God, church, family, work." And the other guy was like, "No, it should be God, family, church, work." And I just remember I'd listen to it back and forth. And I was the young guy. I was like 23. I'm like, I'm supposed to be learning from these guys. And, I'm the young deacon, and I'm just sitting there. And I would be like, I remember once just going, I listened to both, it was really two major guys. And there were two other guys on each of the sides that kind of like agreed with the one spokesman guy. And I was the guy that just sat there. And I go, I guess I just agree and disagree with all of you. I think the priority is God. Sometimes God puts family, that you got to focus on your family. Sometimes it's your work. Sometimes it's the church. It's what does God have for you at this moment? You got to look at the broad picture of things and examine everything. Now there's going to be some things. Like Gina and I talk about this a bunch, when we, because she works with an evangelism team. When you work with an evangelism team, you get lots of different people that join evangelism teams. Not everyone from your church, so not everyone in line with you. And I'd have guys that, they'd go out evangelize every night, ignore their family, and I'd be like, "You're not welcome here." It's like, I don't want you on my team. I mean, I can't stop you from evangelizing. And they'd be like, "What, you think evangelizing isn't good?" Not at the sake of your family. Now, if it's, there may be a time that, you go evangelizing, and because that's the priority God has for you at this moment. And you could be spending time with your family, but it's not like there's a need, to be with your family at this moment. But when it's every night, and in this guy's case, to the neglect of his family, that's a problem. I'd have guys, I had a couple that they were, like if people don't go to church, they wouldn't be on my evangelism team. But I had a couple that went to church, faithful to church, but refused discipleship. And it was something like, I knew the church, and I kept saying, "Are you being discipled in your church?" Because the church was willing to set discipleship up with them, but they weren't. And so, my bride and I got together with them one day and said, "Okay, then why don't we start discipling you?" We met once. We met at a diner to talk about discipling. And that was the last time. And I said to this couple, even though they're the most faithful ones for evangelism, and she was excellent at it. She could start conversation with anybody. But I had to say, you can't be part of the team because they're refusing. They're not maturing in their faith. They just want to evangelize, and they're refusing their church's request to help disciple them. They're refusing anyone's request to help disciple them, and they needed the maturity, right? And so there are times where I would say, no, am I strong on evangelism? Yes, but I turn people away from my evangelism team if I think that they're abandoning their family, they're doing it at the sake of their family or their church or things like that. But yet there's times where, I'm going to go out evangelizing, even though maybe I could be with my family, right? So sometimes people make excuses to avoid harder things, but they want to make it sound spiritual. So people be like, oh, well, I'm evangelizing. Yeah, you're evangelizing because you're trying to ignore your family, because you just don't want to deal with your lack of leadership in the family and the mess it created, or you don't want to deal with having difficulties within a family, and they feel more spiritual because they're out doing something spiritual. Well, maybe not. And so when you have that suffering, when you get back, you get back to your wife and she gives you a tongue lashing, because you've been out evangelizing from literally we'd go 2 p.m. till 2 a.m. We'd go to New York. Right. But, now you go and you do that and, you get the tongue lashing. From what we're looking at Peter, guess what? Maybe those guys deserved it. Right. That's not because they were suffering from their spouse for Christ's sake. They were suffering from their spouse because they were abandoning them. I mean, I went every week, right, in New York, but I would always check with, her to say, okay, can I go? A lot of times I would, because her family was in New York. So we would go into New York, and I mean, there's not much for me to do when their family gets together. They all talk Chinese. And so I would just jet out, go to the subway station, go into Union Square, evangelize for several hours, come back, and, because, I wasn't abandoning the family, because I was just going to sit on the couch and read a book anyway. But there's a balance to it. So I hope that answers your question. If not, I properly avoided it, so I didn't have to answer. Good. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to really say. You have to look at all the factors at that moment. Right? Anything else?
I wanted to back up to the verse 17.
No backing up. I asked any questions at verse 17. That's it. That's it. Done.
So that's okay. I'll talk to you afterwards.
So, go for it.
If you're ready.
I don't know if I'm ready, but I'll try.
I mean, if you're ready to end, then
No. Go for it.
When it says judgment must begin at the house of God, for the time has come that judgment must begin at the house of God. Where is the judgment coming from? Is it God disciplining his church?
Well,
Because of some of the things you mentioned above?
no, I don't.
Or is it an attack from unbelievers?
I think neither. I don't think it's God's judgment on a disobedient church as above, because he made that contrast and brought it back to the Christian. I think that this is, I think what he's there contrasting, that our time of suffering is now, the unbeliever's time of suffering is eternal. So he starts with the house of God here on earth. The unbeliever, their judgment actually starts after there, right?
So the judgment is coming from an unbelieving world.
Yeah. That's what I think. If that helps. All right, then let's close in prayer, and then we'll break up in teams for some time of prayer. Lord, we thank you for your word. We thank you for really the principles that we can learn from it, because it's helpful for us to prepare for what may come ahead of us, and help us to keep our eyes fixed upon you, that we would, as Colossians 3 says, we would just have our minds on things above and not on earthly things. Help us to do that, Lord. Help us to practice that with every day, with everything that we're suffering today, so be prepared for greater suffering tomorrow. In Christ's name, amen.